Hey guys, this is Tom Shepard here at the Elite FTS compound. In our recent table talk, Naomi and I went over how we kind of separate a lot of our training methods into eccentric, isometric, and concentric based methods. So what we're doing now is a series of videos where we're going to take each of those three categories, again, revisit why they would be useful for you in your training, and also then film a lot of those methods so you can see how they're done. So the first thing we're going to do here is just do a quick review of what are the benefits of eccentric-based training methods and how we're going to implement them. So when we say an eccentric-based method, what we're talking about is a method whose primary goal is to strengthen the eccentric component of the lift or the movement. So you are still going to perform the concentric phase of the lift in most scenarios, but the main goal of this method is going to be to strengthen the eccentric phase where you're lengthening under load. So when we're programming these, some of the things that we need to take into consideration are, first off, that actually, from a muscle damage point of view, eccentric actions cause a lot more muscle damage than concentric actions. Now, this has a couple of benefits for us because what that does in turn then is gives us a greater mTOR activation from that part of the lift. So we get a greater hypertrophy response from eccentric methods than we do from concentric methods or concentric part of the lift, which has a lot of benefits when we're trying to train for hypertrophy. But the thing that we need to take into account then is that because there is a lot of muscle damage, we also need to be aware that it's going to take more to recover from than concentric only methods. So for example, when we're programming eccentric methods for athletes who have other sports that they need to play, when they're in season, we will usually take the eccentric based methods out of their training whilst they're in season because that has the highest recovery demands for them. And then likewise, if you're a lifter peaking for a meet, then you might want to take the volume down on these eccentric based methods so that you can recover better closer to your meet when the weights are going to be higher and the recovery demands are higher. Okay. But the biggest benefit that we see for a lot of our lifters when we start implementing these eccentric based methods like slow tempos and things like that is that we get a better effect on strengthening the tendons and the microtendons. So not just the main tendons that we all associate with, but when you have a muscle belly, which is basically a big bundle of muscle fibers, you also have microtendons that connect them all together in a network. Now, when we strengthen those as well, that means the muscle fibers are better connected to each other, and then they are capable of pulling in unison better. So that means we actually get better force transfer through the muscle belly when the microtendons are stronger. So from an injury prevention point of view, stronger tendons is going to mean that we're less likely to injure ourselves, but also those microtendons being stronger is going to mean that we get better force transfer through that muscle, which means we're going to be stronger overall. Next up, we can actually get more strength gains from eccentric dominant methods than from concentric dominant methods. So when there's been quite a few good studies now using reasonably advanced lifters where they split them into subgroups where some of the lifters will actually only do eccentric based lifting. So things like negative only reps where they're lowering heavy loads down to pins and they're not actually doing the concentric phase. And then another group who might be doing normal lifting or even concentric only lifting. And those who do eccentric only lifting actually gain more strength than those who are doing concentric based lifting or regular lifting, even though they haven't been practicing the concentric part of the lift for the majority of their training. So that shows us that the eccentric part of the lift is actually very important, for at least from a neurological point of view, for increasing our max strength. So what we look at that is something that I like to call strength reserve. So the idea is quite simply that if we can get to the point where we can eccentrically control 110 to say 120% of our 1 rep max, that strength reserve is basically a gap that we can fill with our concentric strength more easily than if our eccentric strength was lower. And in fact, in a lot of athlete and sports performance-based circles, a lot of the time we're looking for the athletes to have about 120% eccentric strength just from an injury prevention point of view anyway. Next up, we get a greater activation of the antagonistic muscle group. So when we're doing, say, slow tempo, so let's just take the bench press as an example. If we're doing a slow tempo on the way down on a bench press, we're going to get greater activation into the lats, the biceps, and the upper back, which is great for then when we go back to regular lifting, we know how to recruit those muscle groups better within the lift. And then probably the biggest benefit, in my opinion, of doing slow tempos or eccentric-based methods is that when we're doing eccentric actions, we actually get a greater activation in the motor cortex. So again, they've done studies where you're doing an encephalograph of someone's brain activity during lifting, and during the eccentric part of the lift, the motor cortex is more active than during the concentric part of the lift, which kind of indicates to us that there is more motor learning or more coordination going on during the eccentric part of the lift than there is the concentric. So then when we're talking about beginner lifters or maybe people who are learning new lifts, focusing on the eccentric part of the phase where there's, in theory, more learning going on and more connections being made, means that it can be a better teaching tool than regular base lifting, okay? And last but not least, if we're dealing with someone who needs to be able to perform explosive movements, or even someone who wants to do, say, speed work with bands like overspeed eccentrics, you first need a very good base of eccentric strength to be able to move quickly with a fast load. If you can't move slow with a load, there's no way that you can move fast with a load, because we need to be able to create enough tension and control with that weight slowly first before we can accept that we can lose a bit of that tension to move quick. And this is quite often what we see with a lot of people doing, say, speed work with bands, is that they don't have the prerequisite eccentric strength to do it, so they either end up moving fast but with little tension, or they end up moving slow on the way down, because that's the only way they can keep enough tension to do the lift well. So having a good foundation of doing slow tempo work or overloaded eccentric work will actually allow those people to perform those lifts better and get more out of their speed work. So that's kind of like a brief overview of the benefits of having eccentric-based training. Now, after this, we're going to go into all the kind of methods that we went on about in the table talk and go through them one by one so you can see how they're implemented. Until next time. Welcome back, guys. So this is video number 2 in our series on eccentric lifting. So remember, eccentric lifting is where the muscles are lengthening under load. So in most cases, like a squat or a bench press and things like that, that's where the bar is coming towards you. But there are going to be some lifts where the eccentric phase is a little bit different. So here we've got Naomi who's going to be demonstrating on a lat pull down. This is actually what the eccentric phase is now going to be, where the bar is going up away from her, because that's where the lats and everything else are lengthening under the load. So this video is primarily going to be about using slow eccentrics in your training. Now, different eccentric timings will have different benefits in different scenarios. So the first one that we're going to go over is just what we call like a super slow eccentric. Basically, anywhere between 10 and 20 seconds would fall into that category. And the main benefit that we're going to get out of this is motor learning and coordination. So this is something that you generally use with like beginners to help teach them a new lift and get them controlling that new lift well. Outside of that, the loading is probably going to be so low that you're not going to get a lot of hypertrophy and things like that. So this is mainly a teaching tool for people with new lifts or people who don't have great motor control. So Naomi's going to set up here on the lat pull down. She's actually got her phone set up on the right there, and she's going to perform 15-second eccentrics. Okay, so she's going to demonstrate what that actually looks like. So the concentric is performed normally, and then the eccentric phase, where the bar is traveling up and the muscles are stretching under load, is performed in around 15 seconds. We don't want to be too dogmatic with that, but we want to, as long as they're within a couple of seconds each side, that's absolutely fine. But this is how slow a 15-second eccentric should be. Now, Naomi's using a phone here because if you get most people to try and time the eccentric whilst they're under load, even if the load is quite light, 99% of the time they're going to end up going way too fast. So it really helps if they can have a stopwatch or a phone or something like that, at least at first when they start using these methods, so they can get a real feel for what those tempos actually feel like. So if we just watch Naomi just do a couple more, if you don't mind doing 1 or 2 more, Naomi. And basically the whole time what we'd be cueing this person to do would be to be in complete control of the lift at all times. So if I were to say stop at any moment during the eccentric phase, then we should be able to stop the bar dead at that point. The other thing that we'd be watching for is that the bar speed is pretty much the same all the way through the range of motion. What we don't want to see is, say, good control at the bottom, where perhaps it's easier to control, and then speeding up at the top where the tension is harder to maintain, because that shows that we're not coordinating that part of the lift as well. So we want to, within that 15 seconds, we want to see the same tempo all the way throughout the lift. Bringing the speed down now, or quickening it up, we would do, like, say, a regular slow eccentric would be something we'd class anywhere from like 6 to 10 seconds. Now, when we're using these kind of tempos, the main thing we're going to be looking for is an increased hypertrophy response. The loads are going to be a bit lower because at the end of the day, the slower tempo is going to make it more difficult. But as we discussed in video 1, you get most of your muscle damage and your mTOR signaling in the eccentric phase of the lift. So even though the load is lower, the fact that you're spending more time in the eccentric part of the lift is going to make up for the fact that the load is lower, and you're still going to get a good hypertrophy response. The other benefit here is that now that the load is heavy enough, we're still going to get some tendon strengthening effects, even though the loads aren't extremely heavy. So Naomi's just going to demonstrate. Let's go 6 seconds on these. So what a 6-second eccentric would look like on the lat pull down there. So again, we're looking for the same cues, that she's able to maintain good muscle tension throughout the entire lift, and also that the tempo stays the same throughout the entire range of motion. We don't want to see the bar speeding up. On this lift, on the lat pull down, for example, if you're going to see it, it will generally be in the top half of the movement where the muscles are stretched more and it's harder to maintain muscle tension. So the next eccentric tempo that we're going to look at is just what we would refer to as a controlled eccentric. So basically what we're looking to have the lifter do is just perform the eccentric a couple of seconds slower than they would under a normal heavy load. So if you've got someone who's quite an explosive lifter, that might just be, say, 3 or 4 seconds on the eccentric. If you've got someone who's a slower lifter, a bit more of a grinder, it might be, say, 5 or 6 seconds on the way down. But the idea is just that it's a couple of seconds slower than what their normal tempo would be with a heavy load. Now, when we're using this method, say in the 4 to 6 second range, the loads are going to be higher now. So we're probably working in the 80 to 90% range. Once we progress to this range, then we are going to get a lot of benefit in terms of tendon strengthening, in terms of hypertrophy, and also a more direct carryover to our ability to control heavy loads. So what we're going to have Naomi do now is just demonstrate on the bench press what a controlled eccentric looks like for her. Naomi's a reasonably slow lifter, so she's going to do, say, 4 or 5 seconds on the way down. We're just going to look at what that's going to look like for a couple of reps here. A bit slower. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So just go one more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And rack it. Thank you. Okay. So that's what that kind of tempo would look like. Usually we'd be working in a like 3 to 5 rep range. So this is a good method to be using kind of in the intensification phase of your program, maybe before you start really ramping things up and things start getting really heavy. Now, the other method that we use then a bit further on would be what we call contrast sets. So when we do a contrast set, what we do is alternate between a reasonably slow or controlled eccentric, like Naomi just demonstrated then, and what we class as a normal rep. So the idea here is that what we're trying to do is transfer the control and stability that we create during the slower eccentric rep, and then translate that to the faster rep, which is the tempo that we'd use when we're normally lifting heavy. So what Naomi's going to do here, she's going to do 4 reps. Reps 1 and 3 are going to have, say, a 5 or a 6 second eccentric on the way down. And then reps 2 and 4 are going to be performed how she would perform a maximal rep. So this one's going to be nice and slow. That's it. And now lift the tempo you would if it was a maximal rep. Up, and then slow again. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then normal tempo. Perfect. And rack it. So again, the benefit of that is we're taking, say, the neurological benefits that we get from controlling on the slower eccentric and teaching ourselves how to maintain that tension then when we go back to a faster speed. So that again is something that you could use in an even later stage of training when things are even heavier again, so the 90 to 100% range, to start getting you not just controlling the heavier weights, but also being able to move them a little bit quicker. So guys, the next video in this series of eccentric methods is going to be on the hanging band technique. So basically this is a way of introducing more instability to a lift. It's a great method for cleaning up your bar path and increasing your active stability during a lift. So this is a great alternative for people who don't have access to things like a bamboo bar or a tsunami bar. All you need is a kettlebell or weight plates and some resistance bands, and then you can hang them from the edges of the bar and basically create the same effect that you would get with something like a tsunami bar. So if we just go over to Naomi here, she's going to take her resistance band. You can tie it a load of different ways, however you want, but she's just going to double it over, feed it through the handle of a kettlebell, and then double it over and put it on the bar. Now, the one thing you want to make sure is that when you're setting it up, you don't want to put it too close to the uprights of the squat rack or the bench or whatever you're using, because when they do move around, you don't want them hitting on the rack and then putting you off there. So now that Naomi's set up, she's just going to demonstrate a couple of reps for us so we can see what happens. Now, on lifts where we have to pull the bar out of a rack, the best thing to do is unrack it and just wait a second or two, because basically the kettlebells or the plates are going to move around once you unrack it. You're going to give them a second or two to stabilize, and then she's going to bring it down in a nice controlled manner, aiming to keep the tempo the same on the way down, and then basically having the goal of have the kettlebells move around as little as possible throughout the lift. Now, this method works very well on the bench press and also on the squat, because basically any deviation from your optimal bar path is going to be exaggerated by the movements of the kettlebell. Just do one more for me, Naomi. That's it, and then slam it back in the rack. Awesome, thank you. So we've got kettlebells hanging from here, but it could just as easily be a weight plate or something like that. One thing to take into account is how you tie the band or what band you use. So the lower that this is hanging relative to the bar, the more unstable this is going to be. So if you want the same weight to be less stable and more difficult to do, you could use a thinner band, or you could tie the band in a different manner so that the weight is hanging lower. The other thing to take into account is actually how much weight you have hanging from the bar. In most circumstances, we're looking to use, say, 20 to 30% of the total load to be hanging from the bar. But it's going to depend on what phase of your training you're in. So for example, if Naomi had like 100 pounds on the bar, we'd have 20 or 30 pounds of that in total hanging from the bar. Now, there can be a point of diminishing returns here where you get so much of the weight hanging from the bar that the weight you can use becomes so low it doesn't have as good of a carryover. So we would generally never use more than 40 or 50% of total hanging weight, and that would generally be done really early in the training phases where tempos are very slow, or we want the loads to be lower on purpose, or if it's someone who's really struggling with the technique or the motor control of a lift. As we go through the training phases, we probably then reduce that to say 10 or 20%, and we'd use that for like technical work then on the main lifts. What's up, guys? Next in the series of eccentric methods, we're going to start looking at overloaded eccentrics. So basically with these methods, what we're doing is priming the body to handle heavier loads by handling maximal or supramaximal loads on the eccentric phase of the lift where we're stronger. So generally when we're doing overloaded eccentrics, we're going to be going anywhere from 90 to 120% of our 1 rep max, depending on the training phase and depending on the method that we're using. But the goal is still the same in terms of what we've looked at in terms of the other eccentric methods. We want a nice stable tempo all the way down, and we want even control all the way down as well so that we're not having any loose points in the lift. Now, ideally, overloaded eccentrics will be done using what are called weight releases or eccentric hooks. These are a really great tool for your training and can lead to really rapid strength gains, but they're not always readily available. So what we're going to show you in this video is 2 methods that you can use to get overloaded eccentrics without access to weight releases. Now, the first method we're going to show you is where you can do the eccentric and the concentric phase together, but this is going to require 2 training partners. They're going to unload and reload the plates for you so that you can do the eccentric phase with more weight than you do the concentric phase. So what we've got set up here on the bench is a pin just above the height that Naomi is going to bring the bar down to touch her chest. So the bar is going to be, say, 1/2 inch to 1 inch off her chest at the bottom of the lift. So she's doing as close to the full range of motion as possible. Likewise, if we were doing a squat, the pin would be set just a tiny bit above her bottom position. She's going to lower the weight, which is the supramaximal weight in this case, so anywhere between 100 and 120%, down to the pin. Sheena and I are going to be either side of the bar. We then remove the extra load, which is put on the outside of the bar without a collar on, so it can be removed and put back on quickly. And then Naomi can press up with the reduced weight. She's then going to rack the bar and perform a cluster set because Sheena and I then need time to re-put the weight back on. Naomi's going to set up. So now we've got what would be the supramaximal load on the bar. She's going to unrack it, and she's going to bring it down under control to the pin. Again, we're looking for maybe 3, 4, or 5 seconds on the way down. Once she touches down, we take the weight off. Naomi presses up, racks it, and then the weight goes back on. Now, in a cluster set, she may rest anywhere between 30 and 40 seconds between these reps, because if she was doing a real set, that eccentric phase would be really maximal and very difficult to recover from. But she's just going to go again here straight away just to demonstrate. Again, she's going to bring it down, say 4 or 5 seconds, nice and controlled. Soft onto the pin. Sheena and I then remove the weight and press up. Perfect. Okay. So that is how you would perform it on a bench press or a squat if you've got 2 training partners. Likewise with the squat, you get to the bottom position, your training partners would slide the plates off, you would then do the concentric phase, re-rack the bar, and your training partners would put the plates back on. Okay, so if you don't have training partners to help take the plates off and on the bar for you, you can do overloaded eccentrics on your own by lowering the bar down to a pin. Now the difference with this is because you're going to be unloading the bar yourself, you can't do it as a cluster set, and you're not going to have the concentric part of the lift immediately afterwards. So it's not going to carry over to the main lift quite as well. And also you're not going to be able to do as much volume. So whereas we might do a couple of cluster sets of the previous method that I showed before, maybe 2 to 5 reps, depending on how heavy it is on the way down, when you're doing it on your own, you might do 2 to 4 sets of 1 single repetition with 2 or 3 minutes rest in between. So what that's going to look like is what Naomi's going to demonstrate here is exactly what we did before, where she lowers down the supramaximal load to the pin, which is set just above the bottom position, But then because she doesn't have training partners, she's simply going to get out from under the bar, and then she would reset everything herself. That's it. That would be the set done. Okay, so at this point now, you take your 2 to 3 minutes rest. At that point, you'd use that time to strip the bar off, put it back in the rack. Imagine if, for example, if you're doing this on squat and you've got a couple of plates each side, that alone can take quite a bit of time to do. Now, remember, when we're doing these, not only are we going to get a good carry to the maximal lifting, say in the 90+% range, because of the increased stability and things like that, the main thing we're going to get out of this is the desensitization of the Golgi tendon organs. So the tendon organs are little receptors in your muscle bellies that essentially act as a handbrake for your muscles. They're there to protect you from creating too much force and injuring yourself either by a muscle tear or tearing a tendon. Now, they're set very conservative. In most people who are untrained, they might be able to use, say, 50–60% of their max force before those organs tell the muscle to stop firing because they were concerned about injury. Now, when we're doing overloaded eccentrics, a big benefit we get for the nervous system is that we desensitize those so we can increase the amount of our actual force production we're allowed to use. So when we get kind of top-level athletes who've been training for a long time and using methods such as this, rather than say 50 or 60%, they might be able to use 80 or 90% of their mass force production before those tendon organs tell the body to stop producing so much force. So if we can just have Naomi demonstrate one more time. What we do during our rest period is use that to strip it back off. Good to go. So again, this would be performed just a couple of sets of one. Actually, usually first in the workout, because it can work really well as like a nervous system activation tool before you go and do your regular lifting. And again, we're looking for a controlled tempo, anywhere say around 4 to 5 seconds on the way down. Perfect. Okay, so we've kind of discussed now how you can do overloaded eccentrics for the squat or the bench press using pins at the bottom position. But what we haven't done is address how we can do that for the deadlift. It can be a little bit more tricky, but there are still ways of doing it, especially if you have your training partners like we went over before. So what we're going to demonstrate now is how you can do an overloaded eccentric if you have 2 training partners with you. And basically what we're going to do is very similar to what we did on the squat and the bench, where Naomi's going to perform the concentric part of the lift, where she lifts the bar to the top, and then you're going to have a spotter each side that very carefully places a plate on either side of the bar so that you've then got a heavier load during the lowering phase. Now, the only kind of warning here is that the spotters that you choose need to be quite switched on. They need to make sure that they put the plates on at the same time so that you don't end up lopsided or having one side weighted for a few more seconds than the other. Outside of that, then once the extra plate is on, we're looking for a very controlled descent once again, keeping the alignment the same as it is on the concentric phase. So we don't want to see them rounding over. We want to see them putting the bar down in the exact same pattern, but in reverse that they performed on the concentric. So what that's going to look like is this. Naomi's going to set up for her regular deadlift. Sheena, if you can get the other plate, please. Naomi's going to lift it to the top, and then she's going to hold it for a second or two. Sheena and I are going to slowly put the weight on, slide it all the way. Yep. And then Naomi's going to perform a controlled eccentric over about 4 or 5 seconds down to the floor. Perfect. Thank you. So then once again, if you're doing it using this method, you would do it as a cluster set because you need the time to reset the weight anyway. So you would then have your spotters take the plate off either side, probably take about 30 to 40 seconds rest, depending on how heavy the load is on the way down, and then you'd perform another rep. You'd do anywhere between 3 and 5 reps with that. And again, on the way down, we're looking for anywhere between 100 and 120% on the eccentric, depending on how much experience they have with these methods and how strong they are in terms of their motor control on the way down on the deadlift. Now, if you don't have training partners to do this for you, there are 2 ways that you can do it on your own. You can do it by using the end of safety pins out of a squat rack or using blocks, where you lift the bar just for like a ½ inch or an inch at the top, very carefully walk back so that you clear the pins and then lower it very slowly down to the floor. Or if you're lucky enough to have monolift attachments that can attach to a rack that goes low enough to the floor, you can actually lift the bar off the monolift attachment. The hooks will then swing away, and then you can lower it very slowly to the floor. But again, when we're using that method without partners, we do say 3 or 4 sets of one with about 2 or 3 minutes in between, as opposed to cluster sets that we've just shown there. Until next time, guys. What's up, guys? In the last video now of our series on eccentric training methods, the last one that we're going to look at is doing overloaded eccentric with weight releases. Now, if you're going to do overloaded eccentrics, weight releases are the best method that you can use. not only because they added instability element to the bar. So if we just go over and have a look, unlike in the previous examples where we've got plates on the bar, now that we've got weight hanging from the eccentric hooks, not only do we get the overloaded eccentric, we also get an effect similar to when we do the hanging band technique that we addressed in a previous video, where because the weight is hanging from the bar, it's going to be unstable as we go down and move around, and you're going to have to keep a better bar path and keep tighter to make sure that they don't move around too much and to keep it stable. Now, when we're setting up the weight releases, what we want to do is we want to put them towards the end of the bar, so they're away from the rack or the bench or whatever it might be that we're using them on. And we also want to make sure that we put a collar on the end there for obvious reasons. When we unrack the bar, if the bar's slightly uneven or moves around, it means the weight releaser can't come off the end, at least on one side, and make us unstable. So when we're setting the height for the weight releases, what we want to do is to have them come off as close to the bottom position as we can. So we've set these up for Naomi now so that they come off around a ½ inch to an inch above the bottom of her squat. So that allows her to take the overload as far through the movement as she can, but it also allows her to relax a little bit and get a stretch reflex out the bottom, which is how she normally squats. The other thing that you need to take into account is how the weight releases are going to come off the bar. In this example here, with the rogue ones that we've got here, they're going to come forward. So we want to make sure that there's nothing that's going to stop them from coming forward. So when Naomi walks this out, there's going to be plenty of room for them to come off the bar. So in this example, when we're trying to use it as an overloaded eccentric, we have them all the way through. We want to make sure that the weight releases stay on the bar for as much of the lift as possible. So we've set these up for Naomi already, and they've set so that they come off around a ½ inch to an inch above her bottom position. The reason we do that is, A, we want to make sure that they definitely come off when she goes to reverse the lift, but B, also that allows her to then speed up and get a bit more of a stretch reflex out the bottom of the lift because the extra weight has come off just before that point. Now, another way that you can use these to overload a sticking point and improve your mind-muscle coordination and stability, etc., at a sticking point, is to make them longer and then have them come off just after where your sticking point is. And what you then do is, say your sticking point is at the midpoint of the squat, you'd go down to that midpoint and you would pause in that position. So now you're pausing on the eccentric in that position with, say, 110 or 120% of your max, and teaching yourself how to stay tight and how to produce a lot of force in that position. Then once you start moving again, the hooks would come off and the extra weight would release, and then you can perform the rest of the rep as normal. Now, when you're performing these, they're a very intense method, just like the overloaded eccentrics we looked at in the previous videos. These aren't methods that you would just jump into straight away. You've done a series of videos now, and as you go through them, the methods kind of get more intense and demanding as you go through them. These are not something you jump into straight away if you haven't done any eccentric-based training before. You would start off with slow eccentrics and things like that, and slowly build up the percentages that you're controlling on these slower eccentrics until you end up in a position where you're doing something like this, where you're actually doing super maximal weights on the slow eccentric. So we wouldn't do these for more than, say, 3 or 4 weeks at a time because they are a very intense method. What will generally happen is you'll get very rapid strength gains from them, but if you start to do them for longer than that, you will also burn out. So 3 or 4 weeks, ideally before a peaking block, to get your body used to handling heavier loads or super maximal loads, and then take them out before your peak block so that we don't have the increased recovery demands of this technique during that. So when we're performing the overloaded eccentrics with weight releases, we're going to be performing them in a cluster set manner, purely because we have to re-rack the bar and put the weight releases back on the bar anyway. But also because we're dealing with super maximal loads, it isn't something that we're going to be able to control for rep after rep without that short break in between. The other way that you could use them is as a primer for rep work, which you do earlier in your training cycle. So say, for example, you've got to do a set of 6. You could do the first rep with the weight releaser on the bar. So you say have 100 to 110% on the way down. The weight releaser then comes off. And then because of the extra nervous system activation that you have from the heavier load on the first rep, you can actually perform better in the reps that come after that without the weight releaser. So say you've got 80% on the bar, you'll do 110% on the way down with the first rep. That will then come off, and then you'll perform all your normal reps in a row with 80% on the bar. And once you get used to that stimulus, you'll actually be able to perform better with that 80% than you would if you didn't do the weight releaser work before it. But if we're doing these for max strength, they're generally going to be done with 80% or so on the bar in bar weight, and then we're going to be going up to 120% max done as a cluster set for anywhere between 2 and 5 reps. So if we watch Naomi perform a rep now, just like when we're doing the hanging band technique, it's important to let the bar and the weight releases stabilize a little bit after you take them out. So once she walks back, she's just going to let them settle for a second or two so they're not moving too much. Then she's going to begin her eccentric, which is going to be done with a controlled tempo. Even when we're doing, say, 110, 120% on the bar, we still want them to be able to control the eccentric phase. I'm back in. Now she's doing a pretty slow eccentric there. If that was 110, 120%, we may expect her to do it in, say, 3 seconds. It's not going to be super slow because the weight is so heavy. But if we're doing, say, 90 or 100% on the eccentric, we'd expect the lifter to still be able to do it with that slower eccentric tempo. Now, once she racks the bar, very simply, we put the weight releases back on. She would then take her prescribed rest period, which could be anywhere up to a minute in between reps if they really are very heavy, so 120% on the way down. Once her rest period up, she'd do the same thing again. Let the bar stabilize, and then nice and slow. So when we're doing these type of lifts with the overloaded eccentric, generally we would do them all on one day. So we would do them for, say, the squat and the bench together in one workout, and we would usually only do, say, 2 working sets. So we might do 2 working sets of 3 to 5 reps, and that would be the majority of the workout done. You might have some accessory work to do afterwards, but because these are so neurologically demanding, we wouldn't really be doing any heavy compound lifting after that. It might be some light technical work on the deadlift, say, for example. The other way you could do them is if you kind of do a lift-specific workout where you're doing squat, bench, deadlift throughout the week, you would start with this, and that would be your main heavy work done. You wouldn't do anything heavy afterwards. Again, because it's so neurologically demanding, you're not going to be able to perform well on anything heavy after this point. Now, once you've done these for about 3 or 4 weeks, you're going to cycle them out, as I mentioned before, and that would be when you'd start to go into your peaking phase and you'd be ready to handle those heavier loads because you've already gotten your nervous system used to handling 110 to 120% on the eccentrics using the hooks. Not only that, your body is also used to handling that load with it being unstable because of the way that the weights are hanging from the hooks.